before we get to the transition from the Washington consensus to what you call the Wall Street consensus, which is the one that will be the second neoliberal consensus that will appear and that is still at work and at play right now. Just quickly, maybe let's go back to the beginning of the Washington consensus and what role did the collapse of other consensuses played in the emergence of the Washington consensus. I'm thinking about the Bretton Woods system and maybe consensus, but which sort of created a post-war compact, but also the one that was never implemented, but that was at least presented as a possibility, which was the new international economic order proposed by mostly the non-aligned countries of the global south, but also something that you've known in your early days, the state socialism, Eastern state socialism bloc. So how do we articulate the beginning of the Washington consensus with the collapse of at least two of these regimes and the never emergence of the third one, which would be the NIEO?
All right. So I would, in many ways, the most well-known account is the collapse of the post-Keynesian economic order on the back of the kind of contradictions of the capitalist accumulation regimes in countries in the global north, particularly, but not exclusively, the United States. And an important moment there is the disintegration of the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates that put the US dollar at the center of the international monetary order and tied the US dollar to gold, while avoiding to a certain extent some of the restrictions and kind of contractionary nature of a full gold standard. That moment in 1971, in August 1971, when President Nixon makes a speech, it's a fascinating moment if we kind of think about it, and perhaps we'll go back to it in relationship to where Trump, the second Trump administration is now, which is then as now there was a sense in the American political elite that its position as a hegemon was not benefiting the US, but it was a cost to the US. It was its allies were taking advantage of it. Its enemies were growing in strength. And if you listen to that speech, Nixon says, well, we have three priorities in this before the new international economic order. Nixon came up with the new economic policy plan. He called it like that. And he said, we have three priorities there. The first priority is jobs, trying to increase American jobs, which sounds kind of familiar. The second priority was the cost of living, which was, again, it sounds quite similar to what we have now. And the third one was, he called it the role of the dollar and protecting the American dollar against he called them international money speculators. And that to me is the beginning or marks the beginning of the growing hegemony of financial capital that will solidify during the 1980s and 1990s with neoliberalism, and will kind of become very visible with what I call the Wall Street consensus. And what Nixon meant by international money speculators was he imagined some sort of financial speculators in the euro-dollar market in London that were constantly trying to get or to speculate that the US will either have to drop or to change the rate at which the US dollar was trading to gold, or it would try to change the exchange rate at which surplus countries like Germany, their currencies were trading against the dollar. And this constant speculation that kind of ended up by the late 1960s as being described as a crisis of the dollar. This constant speculation, Nixon attributed to some, bizarre, unknown, like faceless list of international money speculators. When you read the Bank of England's 1971 papers on the euro-dollar market, you see they were American banks in London. The American banks in London were creating offshore dollars in London. They were rerouting some of those offshore dollars for payment reasons to the US and back, and they were the ones who were constantly speculating. And it wasn't just them, obviously there were London banks, there were other banks, but most of the euro-dollar transactions, that was an interbank market, most of it was American banks basically making money and pursuing not the objectives of the American hegemon, but they were pursuing profit making. So to me, that is an interesting moment, 1971, because it kind of signals the breakdown of what let's call it a kind of Keynesian / Bretton Woods consensus, which we, at least I, who am not an expert in that period, that's a historical period that is, I always imagined it as somehow being a bit calmer than, the 1980s and 1990s, because that's where you see a lot more financial crisis. But even that period was a period of very significant tensions between the US and its allies, and the US and the Soviet Union, that play out in the international money arena and that also play out domestically. And the end, when that consensus breaks down with Nixon saying, okay, you know what, we can't defend this system anymore. I'm going to prioritize my domestic economy. I'm going to use my interest rates in order to try to stimulate the economy. I'm going to use my fiscal policy to try to stimulate the economy to achieve higher jobs, or to try to redress the trade deficits. The US was then as concerned about trade deficits and blaming others for trade deficits as it is now. That period kind of opens up the question of was the Keynesian consensus in high-income countries or in rich countries in the global north, was it really a Keynesian consensus in the sense that did it organize the state-capital relationships in a way that basically put the state in the driving seat and that benefited distributionally labor rather than capital? And the standard answer is always yes. This is the era of big government. Even Nixon, when he talks about the end of the Bretton, when he breaks down the parity of the dollar to gold, talks about full employment, and he's not a Keynesian Democrat who dreams of full employment, but that's the language is there. But if you read Hyman Minsky again, he says, you know what, that period actually was a period when the state was subsidizing capital profits. It wasn't. We shouldn't think of it as the glory period of the distributional struggle where labor always won. And to me, so that part of the consensus became a very important political terrain for struggle as to what comes next, and basically particularly with the Volcker shock after the period of high inflation linked to the increase in the price of oil. And the impossibility or the unwillingness of political elites to put in place a system where you'd have significant planning of the economy and significant state ownership of the economy in countries in the global north, you go into the Volcker shock, and that's when that from 1979 to 1982, it's a shock where basically Milton Friedman's view of the world and view of the economy gets a broad audience and gets power to listen. So I'm not sure that this is there is an easy answer to why that consensus broke down there, and why it went into neoliberalism and into the idea that all you need to do in order to resolve the accumulation and inflation problems of the Keynesian era is to reduce drastically the power of organized labor, to put central banks in charge of macroeconomic stability, and to shrink the role of the government. That's the political consensus that emerges from those 1970s. Why a parallel system didn't emerge? I'm not a historian, so I can't account for that particular bit. bit of the story. I am clearer that the new international economic order of countries in the global south, who in 1974, while everything, while the US and the global north is undergoing this kind of period of very profound instability, where the logic of the international economic order is being questioned, countries in the global south, with support from UNCTAD and with support from the dependency school, they articulate a vision of an international world economy where there is more equality, where the post-colonial world somehow manages to become equals to countries in the global north, where patterns of unequal exchange are reversed, where you get technology transfers, where you get industrialization in a way that deals with what Raoul Prebisch described, deteriorating terms of trade for commodity producers in the global south. All these were going to get in this new international economic order. All these were going to be resolved by essentially a more benign global north, which accepts responsibility for the colonial period, which accepts responsibility for reordering the international economic system, which transfers technologies, which accepts industrialization, accepts to lose market share for their industries. And that is probably the shortest lived consensus we have had in some ways, because by the late 1970s, beginning of the 1980s, nobody takes it seriously in the global north. For a while, some more progressive politicians from Germany, for example, they kind of engage with countries in the global south, but mostly the US administrations didn't. And I think that bit died quite easily, also because countries in the global south did not have sufficient coherence or it wasn't a sufficiently coherent group, either ideologically or in terms of or institutionally, to put sufficient political momentum behind this new international economic order. So it was a nice dream. This dream reappears every now and then, although with some kind of less broad geographical scope than it had at the moment. So I would say that was a shorter-lived dream. It died because in many ways it imagined a world of benign relationships between countries that would willingly give up economic and political privilege in the name of some kind of more horizontal relationships. And the third bit that you described, the collapse of state socialism, that is the saddest part in some ways, because I lived through some of it. Fritz Bartel wrote a really interesting book called The Triumph of Broken Promises, that charts the ways in which both capitalist countries in the West and socialist countries and their governments found it increasingly difficult to meet the terms of the social contract that they had been striking with their citizens. And for countries in the Soviet Union sphere of influence, the difficulty came from the fact that the Soviet Union, our hegemon at the time, had a kind of whiny hegemon problem that the US seems to have repeatedly, in which they said, why are we financing your economies, your welfare state, your citizens with cheap oil, when our citizens are poorer or our citizens don't get the benefits of this commodity? And after 1973, it was clear that this commodity was increasing in price, so the distributional politics became a lot more visible. So countries in the Soviet sphere of influence, it became, in many ways, found it increasingly difficult to sustain their planning and particularly their social provision for the citizens, which wasn't like extremely generous. But I can remember in the early 1980s, well, I can't remember, but my parents tell me, or in the late 1970s, early 1980s, we would get free healthcare, free transport or very, very cheap transport, free education, free holidays in the summer, and a lot of different items of food provided directly by the state. So it was a certain burden, and this burden that required imports of oil or imports of various commodities was in many ways accelerated, I would say, by the failure of the plan. In many different countries, the socialist planning didn't work very well. There are big controversies about the extent to which the plan by itself is an inefficient allocation mechanism, or we had inefficient bureaucrats or technocrats, or external conditions made everything a lot worse. I would say there is a bit of a grain of truth to each one of them. But by the late 1980s, it was clear that, especially after Poland goes to gets indebted in international markets, like Romania did, gets an IMF loan, then it has to undergo an IMF structural adjustment. The Washington Consensus starts to kind of come east, and that destabilizes further that regime. And once you have the collapse of the Eastern Bloc in 1989, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992, the Washington Consensus comes to Eastern Europe, and it becomes what we know there as shock therapy, and that is in many ways that is one of the most, I would say, most extreme manifestations of a consensus that is pushed onto countries. Even when the limits or the political and social costs of that consensus become so obvious that even pro-market or free market ideologues are resisting it.
It's just a detail, but maybe it's a nice signal to, future critical macro finance theorists, is the fact that it seems like if we say that we go from one consensus to another, that usually the sign that a consensus is about to crumble and a new one is about to emerge is when a hegemon starts to whine, right? So you have it with Nixon in 71, you have it with Soviet Union at the end of the 70s. Why do we pay for all these people who don't deserve it? Always that. We have it today, so maybe that could be some kind of a canary sign too. But it seems like the whining hegemon seems to be a precursor of a change of consensus. Okay.
Very good. I think you're right in the sense that all consensuses need some kind of hegemon to push it within and outside borders. And once the hegemon doesn't see the benefits of the benefits of pushing that consensus, both ideationally and with the ideational and material benefits that are no longer materializing, or there is some contender that fares better within that consensus, then yes, then the contours of that consensus will change one way or another.
That's right. But with always the discourse that they are taking advantage of us. Right?
Yes.